you've been subscribed to my channel for the past, 3 or 4 years, you'll probably recall two videos that I already covered this subject on, but they were eventually taken down, not by YouTube, but by me. They were poorly done, and I know a lot more about the subject than I do now. Back then, I knew how they were worn, and I knew a brief history of them, but now I understand a lot more about the history of them, and so this video is going to not only cover how to wear different types of collars and cuffs, but it'll also go more into depth about how they kind of changed shapes and types over time. Now, if you wear a long sleeve button-up shirt throughout a hot day, chances are you're going to get a brown ring on the inside of your collar and sometimes on the inside of your cuffs. And for us, all we have to do is throw it in the washing machine and it's good as new. But back then, they didn't have washing machines. You had to boil your clothes just to get dirt out of them. And so our story begins in Troy, New York. A housewife by the name of Hannah Lord Montague in the year 1827 got tired of having to wash her husband's shirts every day just for the sake of some grime around the inside of the collar. So she decided to cut the collar off, launder that separately, and then sewed it back on. Now, this method caught on with other housewives, and it eventually became a business from industrious people, including the Montague family, making collarless shirts that had a button on the front and a button on the back of the neckband to where they could attach collars from there. Now, back then, really the only type of collar that you would see people wearing is more of a turn-down collar, but a lot of times they would have it flipped up, especially for certain occasions. Now, this style came from the mid to late 1700s when men out at sea would flip their collars up to protect their necks from getting wet and the cold. And so this style kind of caught on land, and so it eventually became very common for men to have their collars flipped up. And many more often had this style after detachable collars had even become a thing. So for a long time, up until about the 1850s, they still more or less kept the same shape of collar, and because they weren't starched that heavily, they could still flip them up and down. And it wasn't until about the 1850s when they started coming up with shorter collars that they could actually starch more, because a heavily starched collar that goes up past your jawline is probably not the most comfortable thing. And men started realizing that when they started starching these things more often. While it's really hard to say when they came about, the collar stud became the more common way of attaching shirt collars around the 1850s. It was still seen when people would attach it with a normal button, but it was very seldom. In comparison to what was by then coming about, the imperial collar. And this was a collar that was shorter, so it wouldn't be made for folding down. It was made to specifically stand up. Now, this particular collar is not an 1850s style. This is more like maybe an 1880s, possibly, or even later than that, maybe even 1910s. But they were not quite this short in the 1850s. In the 1850s, they were actually still pretty tall, just not as tall as it would be a flipped up turn down. Now, collar studs came in various shapes and sizes. This particular pair I'm going to use for this imperial collar. This is the front stud because it has to go through 4 layers of fabric. It has to go through 2 buttonholes on the shirt and then the 2 ends of the collar. This only has to go through 2 layers of fabric, which is the back stud, therefore it's shorter. When applying the back collar stud to the shirt, a lot of times you'll find, instead of the buttonhole going all the way through the shirt, you'll find a little pocket on the back of the neckband. This is what's called the stud pocket. And so you would slide the stud up through the pocket and poke it out the buttonhole, which I am failing to do so. There we go. Usually it's not that hard. And the reason that they were in a stud pocket was because it actually prevented it from riding up against your neck when wearing it. And some shirts, although not a lot, did actually have, for a short period, a stud pocket on the front side as well, but most shirts didn't. So when applying the front stud, you poke it through the first 2 buttonholes like so. And then you'll find on your collar, of course, there are 3 buttonholes. There's 2 on the front, 1 on the back. So you would attach it on the back. And then you would attach it to the front. Right over left, as gentlemen do, although some women did wear detachable collars as well, depending on their outfit, and they would do left over right. There we are. Just for reference, this is what the collar would look like while wearing a tie. Now, this is a modern tie. Unfortunately, pretty much all of my ties are modern. I can't really seem to find any actual vintage ties that aren't through the roof expensive. And I get most of my stuff at thrift stores anyway, aside from the collars, of course. So when it comes to finding a vintage tie, you would think it to be a little bit easier at a thrift store, but surprisingly not. While most shirts back in the day were not only pullovers because the button placket only went halfway down, they also typically had a strip of fabric in the back that would go right here underneath the stud pocket. My shirt doesn't have that. However, that brings us to our next kind of back collar stud. This little booger was invented in the 1890s, where it actually kind of folds down like a T-bar, and it is used to retain the tie. It is literally a tie retainer within a collar stud. So if I were to put it on right now, remember the fact that it's there. And the reason I say that is because we're now going into our next kind of collar. As I mentioned earlier, imperial collars for quite a while were actually a lot taller than the one I was just wearing. But men found this pretty uncomfortable because, for one thing, they could hardly look down. They would have to bend forward to look down. And that's what brought the invention of the wing collar. A lot of times you'll hear people call these a wing tip collar, but that's technically wrong. Wing tip is for shoes. It's called a winged collar. And sometimes people will also call this a butterfly collar as well. Now I'm going to apply my front collar stud, which in this case is a white one. And once again, putting on the collar on the back. Now I've got my tie on, and so what I do is I take my little collar stud back here and I flip the big part down and the little part up. And there you have it. As you might have guessed, the tie retainer is simply to keep it from sliding up. One thing I'd like to mention before we move on to the next kind of collar, this collar in particular is actually from 1922. At least that's what I was told by the person who sold it to me on Etsy. So I assume it's from 1922. I could be wrong, they could have been wrong, but I'll take their word for it. And the thing is, by the 1920s, at least here in America, detachable collars were kind of falling out of style. People still often wore them, but they were usually wearing the soft kind of collar, which I'm actually going to get to in a minute. And when wearing it with a tie, one could almost mistake it for an attached collar because it doesn't look detachable. But when it comes to the wing collar, the first attached wing collar, like a wing collar sewn onto the shirt, was not invented until the 1960s. And so if you ever watch a movie that was made or takes place before the 1960s and you see this kind of shirt collar on somebody, then chances are it's detachable. And I mean, you see detachable collars practically everywhere in the movies. Not just these kinds, but the turn down kinds, the imperial kinds, all kinds of detachable collars practically everywhere. If you watch Peaky Blinders, you see them in literally every episode. If you've watched the movie Titanic, most of the people in the first class area were wearing detachable collars, and you can even see Leo DiCaprio wearing his unbuttoned in the third class party scene. For these next two collars, I'm going to wear my favorite pair of studs. And now it's time for kind of the unsung hero of the detachable collar realm. Not just the detachable shirt cuffs, which I'll get to once I'm done with these two collars, but also the soft collar. Yeah, done? Thanks. Anyway, so this is a good example of how detachable collars started, because they were more or less like this, and so they would be worn, there we go, they would be worn flipped up in such a way and often worn with a cravat tied around it. And a lot of times when people were wearing their cravats, but they still kind of wanted it to turn down, sometimes they would turn it down only about a quarter of the way, but then they would have it come down further near the front. For example, I like to call it the Abe Lincoln collar, because Lincoln often wore his collars like this. And then for formal occasions, he would have it flipped up. But the normal way to wear this kind of collar would be folded halfway down like so. The thing is because this collar is soft, you have the ability, much like a modern day shirt, to flip the collar up after you attach it. And so there's no real worry about putting the tie on once you attach it. But when you have a stiff turn down collar, which I'll get into in a minute, that's when things kind of get a little tricky. And so there you have it. This is what the soft collar would look like. Looks an awful lot like a modern attached collar, right? And that's the thing. These were very, very common in the 1920s in America, but a lot of people look at 1920s photos and they assume it's still attached because it looks attached. Now, I would use one of my club collars for this, but I think this is a better example because this is kind of the tallest turn down collar I have. It's not a club collar, it has pointed edges, but here it is. The tall pointed collar that I have. And so I'm using this. But if you were to wear a stiff turn down collar, if you tried to put it on and flip it up like I just did with the soft collar, you'd have a bloody hard time. And so there are different ways of applying your tie to this kind of collar, but the easiest way is this. You take your collar and you actually kind of load your tie into it. You kind of put your tie inside the collar before even attaching the shirt. Now, they did make clips for these to hold the tie in place so it doesn't slide out when you're putting it on, but paper clips kind of do the same job, and in all fairness, I never even do either of those because it might slide out a little bit, but it's usually no inconvenience whatsoever. So you attach it to your back collar stud, and then you'll notice when you attach your collar, one side, or one end I should say, is considerably longer than the other. This is called the tongue, and so this tongue should always go in the front to give your collar sort of a solid piece look to it. And then you tie your tie, and off you go. So here's how it would look with a tie, although sometimes when you're wearing these kinds of collars, naturally the tie will slide down throughout the day, and so sometimes you'll see the collar look more like this, with the tie knot at the bottom. Now when it comes to detachable cuffs, these particular cuffs are starched, but they're a little bit soft. So maybe I need to restarch them, I don't know. But in order to do that, I'd probably have to wash the old starch out. So I kind of don't want to have to go through that. Around the 1900s, detachable cuffs kind of started falling out of style. I mean, they were still around for quite a while, but especially by the 1920s, these things were practically nowhere to be seen, at least not in America. And much like collars, they did have softer detachable cuffs, so this is still somewhat accurate. They were usually attached with cufflinks. Now the thing is, cufflinks back then were not like these. This is the usual modern T-bar cufflink. Well, not really modern. T-bar cufflinks have been around since probably the 1930s. And I just dropped one. Cufflinks back then were usually two-ended and it had a little chain on the inside, or sometimes if you were to wear barrel cuffs rather than kissing cuffs, you would wear a bachelor button. I don't own any kind of cufflinks like these. Unfortunately, all of my pairs of cufflinks are T-bars like this pair, but this pair was actually my great-grandfather's and is kind of my main go-to. So let's consider the fact that you probably wear cufflinks like this yourself. What you would do is you would poke it through one side of the cuff, and then you'll find that you have two buttonholes on your sleeve like that. So then you would put it through both buttonholes, and then you guessed it, through the other side of your cuff. And there you have it. And then you would repeat the process on the other side. Now, one thing that I really didn't want to leave out of this video, because that's actually why I ended up making two videos in the past, was the detachable shirt front. This particular one is quite large. They're not usually this big. These were usually heavily starched and ironed, and sometimes you would have to attach studs like this one, except for some reason it has a button on the bottom. But it also has a little buttonhole tab on the bottom. Now, this is kind of a comically large buttonhole. They weren't usually this big. And same with the neckband. I don't know why the neckband buttonhole is so worn out too. I mean, it is old as dirt. But anyway, when attaching this, pretty much all you would do is you would attach it to your neckband, and then at the bottom, typically your fly would have a button at the top or a hook And in this case, it's a hook. And so what you would do is you would attach it to the hook. And in all fairness, these trousers are vintage and they're fairly high-waisted. So if anything, you're looking at the level of my belly button rather than anything suspicious. These were often called dickies, but you could also refer to them as detachable shirt fronts or bibs or something of the sort. When wearing them, you would usually have a waistcoat and a coat on, and so these would look just like a normal shirt. You wouldn't even be any of the wiser unless you saw that person get dressed that morning. Which, why would you watch someone get dressed? Actually, I shouldn't say that. I'm literally making a video of me doing so. They kind of reached their peak popularity in maybe the 1890s, but by the 1900s and the 1910s, they kind of were really only common with entertainers and musicians of sorts, because a lot of the more wealthy people had shirts with attached stiff fronts. If anything, it looked like a dickie, but it was sewn onto the shirt. So they kind of saw these things as the shirt equivalent of a pre-tied bow tie, is what I remember reading on some article about them. And they kind of became the subject of ridicule because of their tendency to pop out of place. That's why you see these more often in cartoons rather than actual period movies. Sometimes you will see them, but it's usually in the background and it's not quite focused on. Cartoons reference these things a lot. The best part about these, however, was the fact that you could wear a suit in the summertime or even just on a warm day in general, and you could wear one of these without having to wear a full shirt underneath. You could just wear a collar around your neck with only the one stud in the front attached to this thing and cuffs around your wrists. You put on your jacket, nobody's going to know the difference. And so there you have it. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope it was educational. God, it's been so long since I've actually done a video outro. What did I used to say? I used to say it in a few videos. Be brave, be safe, and have a nice day. That's what it was.